Okay, before we start stitching, I'm sorry, I meant to show you, we do have to load the fabric into the hoop. And you can see I've already got my thread, so I'm just going to pull that through right here for now. And you can see there's a fastener on the top that helps you to loosen and tighten. The larger hoop, the one that adjusts, goes on top, and then the smaller hoop goes behind the cloth. Okay, so what you do is you place the larger hoop on top and then the smaller hoop on bottom, and keeping the center of your design in the center of your hoop, and then you push this down over it, and I might need to loosen it a little more. Again, this is so difficult to do one-handed. Alright, now I got both hands I can work with. So. There we go. And now that I've got them in place, I'm going to start tightening. A little ring. Okay, and after you have it tightened down a little bit, what you want to do, see how the fabric's a little bit loose there? You just gently pull it to make sure that your fabric is nice and tight. I'm going to tighten it down a little bit more. That your fabric is pulled very taut. You know, that it has, it doesn't give a lot when it's pressed on, that it's fairly tight. And you just go around and you just, not real hard because you don't want to cause the fabric to skew the little, you know, the nice little squares. You don't want them to become warped. So you're just going to gently pull it around until you get the fabric nice and tight, and then you're going to tighten it down as much as possible so that the fabric doesn't come loose while you're stitching. Okay, so here's what it looks like once you have the fabric loaded into your hoop. And this is a really good size hoop for this size fabric. If I was going to be working with a much larger piece of fabric, then of course I would want a larger hoop, and if I worked with a smaller piece of fabric, I'd want a smaller hoop. And I've got my center marked here. So where I'm going to start stitching is with this G, and I'm going to start on this lower part of it. Now actually I think what I'm going to do is just count over, and I'm going to start with the end of the G and then work my way around it, and then the O and the D. So from the center of the fabric, I'm going to count over 1, 2, 3. So then the outside of the third square from the center is where I'm going to start stitching the D. And in counted cross stitch, you don't do knots. What you do is secure your fabric with other stitches, because if you had a bunch of knots on the back of the fabric, when you tried to frame it, those knots would show through and they would cause little bumps on the front of your design, and those would be unsightly. So you always secure, whether you're starting or finishing a stitch, you always secure it using the back of other stitches. Okay, so I took my needle out the center, but I held the place by just putting my fingernail there. And as I showed you on the design, we're going to count over 3 squares from the center. So that's 1, 2, 3. And this is where our G starts. And I'm just going to eyeball that and come up through the back of the fabric. You can see my needle poking through right there. And now what I'm going to do is turn the design over and see where the needle's pulling through. And to start with, I'm just going to hold it in place with my finger until I can get stitches over it to hold it in place. So referring to the design, I'm going to be doing this part of the G, and as I showed you, this is the first, second, third square over, and the first stitch is going to be this little tail of the G, and it just goes straight up. So I'm just going to go straight up from the hole I just pulled through, right there. I didn't hold my string tight enough. Let me go back and do that again. Okay. And there's our first stitch. And so what I'm going to do is count. Okay, so this was the first stitch. So we're going to do 2 more squares up. So now this is where I'm going to catch, this is where I'm going to catch this tail in the stitching. I'm going to pull it over, and I'm going to go to the next hole up, okay. So now that tail is caught in our stitching, and it's not going to come loose. And we didn't have to use a single knot. So back to the front of the fabric, you can see where I've pulled up on the next square, I've pulled the thread through this hole, and I'm going to go back down and here you can catch the tail again. You can bring it back across this way and then go up to the next square. And now we've got that tail very secure because we've got it caught in 2 stitches now. It's a little bit harder with what they call back stitching, and that's what this is when you're making straight lines and you're not doing the actual crisscross stitching. This is called back stitching. Securing your tails can be a little bit harder with back stitching than with regular cross stitching. When we get to the regular cross stitching, I'm going to show you how to do secure the tails again. And the other thing I want to talk about now is tension. If you were to pull your string too tightly when you go through the holes, then you're going to make the holes bigger and your design isn't going to look as good. So you don't want to pull the thread too tight when you're stitching, but you don't want it to be too loose either, because again, it's going to distort the image. So now I'm going to continue working on the G. And as I can see from my design, now I've got 1, 2, 3 squares up that I've outlined one side of the square, and now the G has a little tail that goes in this way, so I'm going to do that. And what I've done is just come through that hole in the fabric. And meet that stitch there. And now I'm going to go and start coming on this part of the G and work my way back around to where I started. And the way you do that is now we've gone down into through a hole that's right here in this part of the G, and what I'm going to do is come up. I'm going to go 1 square straight up and come up through this hole right here. So you can see one square straight up, and then this is the hole I'm going to come up through. Right there. And then this stitch is at a diagonal, so rather than going to the hole straight up, I'm going to go to the hole that's across. And then the other part of the top of the G is the same type of stitch, but in the opposite direction. And that's the top of the G. And then we have 1, 2, 3 back stitches straight down. We're going to have 2 more diagonals at the bottom like we had at the top. And now we've completed our first letter. And it really is that simple. And I'm just going to continue to count and continue to stitch. The next letter I'm going to do is going to be the O. And we left off right here on this part of the G, so I'm just simply going to move across and start stitching my O. And then my D.